Welcome to Soldano Guitar Works Studios, and today at OGW we're going to be talking about my dream amplifiers. Now again, my definition of dream amplifiers is similar to my definition of dream guitars as we did in my previous list. It's amps that I have played or amps that I have seen that I'm a huge fan of and just have a bit of an affinity with. They're not specific amps used by specific musicians at concerts. They're not necessarily built specially. They're just particular models that I've always really loved. So first on the list is the Soldano SLO100. So the Soldano SLO100 is a 100-watt all-tube head. The head includes an integrated impedance selector, so you can use a 4, 8 or 16 ohm speaker cabinet. It features an effects loop hardwire bypass. Features a global 3-band EQ, presence and depth control. And it also features a variable slave output, which means you can use it with IRs for recording or also combining amps together. Now these are the specs of the modern SLO100s that are available now. I'm sure there will be variables dependent upon the year of manufacture. Now, I thought it bears to mention some of the notable users of the amps that I'm listing. Specifically for the SLO100, you have John Mayer, Gary Moore, John Frusciante of the Red Hot Chili Peppers, and probably the most notable, they say, is Eddie Van Halen. So I first came across a Soldano in a local guitar shop to me. I played around with it with some of the guitars in the shop, so I didn't really have like my own guitar with me with my own specific pickups that I like in it. And I immediately noticed how great the guitar sounded. I think I was playing the first time with one with a Gibson Les Paul with humbuckers, so it had a big meaty sound anyway built into it. And that Soldano just sounded amazing. It's obviously one of the older models than the ones that are available now, but it was just phenomenal. And from what I understand of the new models, they still have that precise, heavy, meaty drive tone. Although not a cheap amplifier, it is an accessible amplifier you can go out and buy. There are more sort of new versions available now from different websites and different shops, and I'm sure you can find second-hand ones around as well. This is an amp that at the time I was playing around with it, it was when I was testing amps to buy for myself. I wanted to buy a head and a cab as I'd only had combos before. But being that I was playing bassing in a band, I didn't feel it was necessary to spend as much as it cost at the time for myself, because it would probably not get the use that warrant that cost. New now, I've seen them available for around £3,600. I think the cheapest I saw was £3,200. So by no stretch of the imagination, a cheap amp, definitely an investment amp and one you're going to want to keep around for a while. But nevertheless, a beautiful amplifier, and my experience of it was amazing. I have to this day loved it, and will continue sort of till the day I manage to maybe try and get my hands on one. Another factor as to why I really like the SLO100 is actually down to line 6. I first got a pod version 2.0 when I was a teenager and absolutely loved a specific high gain sound on it, and it turned out that was modelled on the SLO100, so it kind of got my interest going. And when I finally played with one in a guitar shop later on, I realised what the amp was and was just immediately taken by the sound. I even dialed in some of the settings to match what I would do on my pod, and it did sound great. And I still use that sound on the pod today now to track small demo pieces. Next one on our list is the Frankenstein. Now the Frankenstein head was a 100-watt all-tube power. Now the Frankenstein was a 100-watt all-tube head. Selectable 4, 8 and 16 ohm speaker output. It featured the clean and dime channels with separate volume and 3-band EQs per channel. These are the specs of the Crank 100-watt Frankenstein, not the Frankenstein Plus, which I believe is 120 watts. So again, notable users, I think this goes without saying, Dimebag Darrell is the one name that comes to mind when you think of Crank. I first came across the Frankenstein when I was playing in a band, and we were in the studio recording an EP together. We were talking about guitar tones and guitar sounds. Our guitarist already had a 5150, so he was going to use that for the first track. I asked him what he would use for the second track, and he said, I'll maybe just mess with the tone of the 5150. And the engineer at the time was a guitarist, and me and him would talk a lot about guitars and a lot about amps. And he suggested, well, I've got a Frankenstein here in the studio that belonged to the owner of the studio. Would you like to try it out? And with my guitarist's guitar, it sounded fantastic. I believe at the time he had a guitar that was loaded with EMGs, and it worked beautifully. And to have it as that opposite tone to the 5150, they were different enough where you could dial in sort of some of the aggression on the crank and really get some of the bite focus sort of tone and have more of a bigger sound with the 5150 and mix them, and it sounded beautiful. I had limited time to play around with it in the studio as I was tracking bass, and we were on a small sort of like, you know, budget and a tight schedule. And the time I did get to play around with it was mostly doing some guide tracks for the drummer in the band, and it was fantastic sounding. It was just fantastic feeling as well. And I was playing it with a ESP, I believe it was an Eclipse or maybe a 256, I can't remember exactly, but it was an EMG loaded ESP and it sounded fantastic. In doing my research, I looked around at cranks for sale and I couldn't really find any Frankensteins for sale in the UK right now. I'm sure there are people out there who've got them. I'm sure they're available in other countries, but I wouldn't personally be looking at buying anything from another country and shipping it, especially a tube amp. But the ones that I saw were the Rev 1s and the Rev SSTs and things like that that were available. Now the SSTs being sort of a bit cheaper were around the 400 to up to around 700 mark. I think maybe that's to do with condition or possibly the shipping prices. And I saw some of the Revolutions for around £1,500. In my opinion, a great amplifier, quite overlooked amplifier, not commonly available, so that's probably another reason why it is overlooked. But also, as a metal guitarist and metal fan, anything to do with Dimebag is obviously sacred. Last but by no means least is the PV5150. The PV5150 was a 120 watt head that could be run through a 16, 8 or 4 ohm cab. It featured a clean and a lead channel with an individual rhythm and lead pre-gain and post-gain control. It featured a 3-band EQ and individual resonance and presence controls for the power amp. The 5150 has been used by a lot of metal producers and musicians. It's famously used by Colin Richardson and Andy Sneap. Machine Head used one on their Burn My Eyes record in 1994. Now, to distinguish the difference between the use of a 5150 and a 6505 nowadays would be quite difficult, what with reamping and other production techniques that are used. But the tone of the 5150/6505 has become synonymous with many metal bands and the metal. I mean, it's a name that immediately conjures up certain images in your mind. PV is a classic. The 5150 is an absolute icon of an amplifier. I had the chance to play around with one extensively in 2 of my former bands, including the one that I was in the studio with and talked about with the crank with. They had the guitarist had a 5150 in that band. The guitarist I was in a band with before that one had a 5150 as well, and I would spend a lot of time in the studio writing, using that amp with him. And when we came to record our EP, we used the 5150 in the studio, and I recorded the second guitar for the EP, and I recorded the third guitar parts on the EP with that amp. It's a fantastic amplifier. There's not much else that can be said about it. It's just industry standard for metal. There's so many bands that use it. I wouldn't even bother listing after bands. You just need to Google who use the 5150 and on what albums, and you'll see how great that sound is and how great that amplifier actually is. Very hard to come across nowadays to actually find a block letter 5150. Now, you have to remember I said block letter there, and I'll get into that in a second. They're around £1,200 to £1,800. 5150 Mark IIs might be a bit cheaper, I'm not sure, but I haven't seen many of them for sale, especially not in the UK. Now, the reason I pointed out saying block letter there is I'm not discerning really between a block letter and a non-block letter, or even a Mark II. I think they all sound amazing. I think one of the things I found in my research is that the block letter was renowned for its power tubes, which most of the amps would be so old now that they probably would have been changed out by most people. And if I'm honest, I have used a 6505 a bunch of times in the past in other bands. They're fantastic amps, they sound amazing. You can achieve the same sound, like a combo of the classic EMG 5150 sound. If you have the EMG 6505, it's not that far off. I think there are audiophiles out there who will argue, who probably know way more about the technical aspects of it and could completely, school me on those sort of things. But for me, I'm more about the sound, less the technical. My guitarist in my current band has a 6505 and it's a fantastic amp. It sounds brilliant in practice, it sounds amazing live. Twinned with my other guitarist's Marshall, it sounds phenomenal live, and it's something that I think will be a prevailing sound and a prevailing amplifier throughout metal. So there we have it. Not a super crazy long list, but 3 fantastic amplifiers in my opinion. As you can tell, I'm a big metal guy, so they were focused mostly on high gain amplifiers. I don't think I have specific clean style amps that I really want or really think about a lot, but that's something I still sort of appreciate, a clean sound. But this time we're talking high gain and metal. So if you enjoyed the video, please like, share, subscribe. Let us know in the comments what your dream amps are. Maybe you own your dream amp. Please let us know what you'd like to see us talk about in the future. And take it easy and take care.